Okay. So do you have any other questions about assignments or anything before we get started?
I just wanted to run those two by you.
Okay.
Make sure there's one, that was gonna be a good topic that I can get
Uh-huh.
at least 2,000 words out.
I think absolutely, and I think like the fact that you're dealing with something that is prevalent in literary theory anyway means that you'll have an easier time cobbling together sources too. Because like even if you can't find sources on this phenomenon specifically in Tolkien,
I can find it for
exactly, yeah, you can find general sources on it and sources that discuss it in other contexts that you might be able to apply. So no, I think it's a good idea.
And then I definitely want to run the title for my presentation by you.
Yeah.
Just kind of give an idea, like this is how I'm thinking while I'm
Yeah.
doing this research.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, and you got the sample exam questions I said,
Yes.
right? Okay, good. All right, so what do you want to talk about today? Where do you want to start?
Let's talk about the setup for I'm going to say this all kinds of wrong. Minas Tirith.
Okay, yeah.
And-
Minus Tirith,
Minas
Minas
Tirith.
Tirith, whatever. It's in a made-up language, so it doesn't really matter.
Well, like how the city's set up, it's set in like
Uh-huh.
7 levels,
Yeah.
and with, you've got like the flatlands and the pastures at the bottom, and then you've
Uh-huh.
got the steward at the top and the Hall of the Kings.
Yeah.
And how like each level is like responsible for some part of that community,
Uh-huh.
and also how it kind of resembles Gondolin.
Okay, yeah. Right, yeah, it's built into a mountain, yeah. It's a defensive structure, right, primarily, Minas means tower in which Sindarin is the Elvish language, and Tirith means guard, so it's the Tower of Guard. And I think it is, I think, similar to Gondolin. Yeah, and I think it's interesting too to note, sort of as you did there, the implied hierarchy in the way the city's structured, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have the king or the steward at the top. And everyone else on sort of like progressive levels down below. So yeah, I think like this suggests kind of highly ordered hierarchical society, right?
Yeah.
And we might be able to take some of this back to some of Faramir's dubious anthropology in the chapter in the window on the west. So we talked about last time like how or maybe it was the time before, about the way he talks about the decline of Gondor and the decline of the men of Numenor, right?
Yeah.
That, they start envying the elves and, the idea of endless life unchanging. And this kind of leads to their decline both in vigilance and in vigor and numbers, right?
A springless autumn.
Yeah, springless autumn. And then I think if we go back to, I'll just read this because I see you didn't bring the 2 towers today, which is fine, because I didn't ask you to. But just after we have that whole thing about the last king of the line of Anarion having no heir, right? But the stewards were wiser and more fortunate. Wiser, for they recruited the strength of our people from the sturdy folk of the seacoast, and from the hardy mountaineers of the arid Nimraeus. And they made a truce with the proud peoples of the north, who had often assailed us, men of fierce valor, but our kin from afar off, unlike the wild Easterlings or the cruel Haradrim. So it came to pass in the days of Sirion the 12th steward, and my father is the 6th and 20th, that they rode to our aid, and at the great field of Celebrant they destroyed our enemies, that had seized our northern provinces. These are the Rohirrim, as we name them, masters of horses, and we ceded to them the fields of Kalinardan that are since called Rohan. For that province had long been sparsely populated, and they became our allies, and have ever proved true to us, aiding us at need, and guarding our northern marches in the gap of Rohan. Of our lore and manners they have learned what they would, and their lords speak our speech at need. Yet for the most part they hold by the ways of their own fathers and to their own memories, and they speak among themselves their own north tongue. And we love them, tall men and fair women, valiant both alike, golden-haired, bright-eyed, and strong. They remind us of the youth of men as they were in the elder days. Indeed, it is said by our lore masters that they have of old this affinity with us, that they are come from those same three houses of men as were the Númenóreans in their beginning, not from Hadden the golden-haired, the elf friend maybe, yet from such of his sons and people as went not over the sea into the west, refusing the call. For so we reckon men in our lore, calling them the high, or men of the west, which were Númenóreans, and the middle peoples, men of the twilight, such as are the Rohirrim and their kin that dwell still far in the north, and the wild, the men of darkness. So there's a hierarchy in the way Faramir regards human beings, right?
Yeah.
High, middle, and wild. And even in the way he talks about the middle men, right? You know, the Rohirrim, like their allies and their friends. Do you detect like a little bit of a patronizing note in there?
Yeah. Like, oh, they're our allies and they're our friends.
Uh-huh.
But that's about it. Like, we wouldn't invite them to our high table.
Yeah, and there's even like this sort of backhanded compliment, right? That they remind us of what people were like in the elder days, right? There's in both of these other categories, the implication that they're primitive, right? And with the so-called wild men here, not only are they primitive, right? They are primitive and also evil, right? Right? The wild Easterlings and the cruel Haradrim, right? So Faramir's like, this is actually one of the reasons why I think it's like, it always made me scratch my head a little bit why in the film they have Faramir voice that thing about sympathy for the dead the dead Hardan soldier instead of Sam. Because it doesn't seem that Faramir actually does have that kind of sympathy, right? He seems to regard himself as a belonging to a different and better class of human beings than that dead soldier, while Samwise is still, quote unquote, naive enough to sort of believe in relative equality between peoples, right?
I promise I'm listening, right?
No, it's, yeah. So yeah, and I think, yeah, this notion of the hierarchy of levels of Minas Tirith that you noticed also like kind of suggests this kind of stratified society, right? Mm-hmm. That, while he does say that the stewards were wiser than the kings and that they mixed the strength of the people with, the ordinary folk of... they mix the strength of the men of Númenor with the ordinary folk of the coasts and the mountains and whatnot. There's also the implication that those folk are not quite up to scratch, right?
Yeah. And Minas Tirith's decayed. And I think one of the best quotes for that is the description of Denethor.
Okay, yeah.
Wish I had highlighted this.
Is it,
well, in a way he also represents Minas Tirith. It says, Pippin saw his carven face with its proud bones and skin like ivory, and the long curved nose between the dark, deep eyes. And he was reminded not so much of Boromir as of Aragorn. So
Okay.
in a way, he looks like a city. He's tall, he's proud, pale ivory skin.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's hunched and he's clutching his son's broken horn.
Yeah.
He's broken it. This is like seeing him with the horn is like the first hint that this man is broken. And then when Faramir is shot with the arrow and he calls for wood and oil, it's like the literal straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah. And I think, and notice that it seems like nobility can be detected in some sense in appearance, right? That, the men of the West all look the same, right? They've got dark hair and gray eyes and pale skin, right? And that's they look like these carven statues, right? To go back to where Pippin first enters the steward's chamber. The door opened, but no one could be seen to open it. Pippin looked into a great hall. It was lit by deep windows in the wide aisles at either side, beyond the rows of tall pillars that upheld the roof. Monoliths of black marble, they rose to great capitals carved in many strange figures of beasts and leaves. And far above in the shadow, the wide vaulting gleamed with dull gold, inset with flowing traceries of many colors. No hangings, nor storied webs, nor any thing of woven stuff or of wood were to be seen in that solemn hall. Right? Everything's stone.
Nothing living.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to that thing that Faramir was talking about the Gondorians' desire for endless life unchanging, right? Their envy of the elves. But between the pillars there stood a silent company of tall images graven in cold stone. Suddenly Pippin was reminded of the hewn rocks of the Argonath, and awe fell on him as he looked down that avenue of kings long dead, but preserved here in stone, right? Oh, go ahead.
They preserve their dead. Oh, that's I almost wrote dead things. Dead kings. That idea that I think we touched on it in the Volsung sagas. That as long as you speak of someone, even after they're dead, they're never truly dead.
Yeah. I think that's not a culturally specific idea, right? That's something that seems to be really like a prominent idea in cultures across the world. This notion that people live in memory, right? That as long as someone's memory is kept alive, then that person is never truly gone, right? And yeah, it seems like the people of Gondor are very much focused on this preservation of the past, right? That, they're people of stone. I mean, Gondor even means stone land.
Well, not even just the people of Gondor, like throughout Middle Earth, from the Hobbits to the elves. Just about every time you meet one of these species, they recount not only their lineage, but their parents' lineage.
Sure. Although the elves don't usually have to count as many.
Yeah.
Because
but they'll talk about, I knew so-and-so when he or they or she was just this tall and da-da-da-da. It's like they're constantly keeping that person alive.
Yeah.
Even with the elves who, they may not die, but they may fade or go back to the...
Back to the West,
Back to the West. They're still keeping that memory of them alive.
Yeah.
And you see that with every group in Middle Earth.
Yeah. Although I think that one thing that we might note as a kind of difference is that a lot of these other groups have affinities with living or growing things, right? So, for the, hobbits, are big into agriculture, right? They're gardeners, they're farmers. The elves are closely associated with trees and forests. Even the Rohirrim are associated with horses, right? Right, their love, their effort, their concern is given to something that lives rather than to something unliving that can be shaped into an unchanging form, right? So, I think it's also interesting that we get all of this from Pippin's perspective as well, right? From the perspective of one of these, Hobbit agriculturalists. In fact, we get a lot of kind of parallel observations in these early chapters from Pippin and from Merry, right? Pippin gives us the perspective, our perspective character for chapters 1 and 4, and Merry is our perspective character for chapters 3 and 5 and part of chapter 2, right? And what is it that makes them unusual in all of this?
They went from being kind of passive characters, being luggage, to now they're active characters. Pippin sworn his loyalty to Denethor and Minas Tirith, and Merry's sworn his to the Rohirrim. And they're being active characters. They go from these silly children to being active characters in the war against Sauron.
And yet their level of activity is still curtailed in certain ways, right? What's Merry afraid is going to happen to him? Well, is he? Let me put it this way.
Okay.
What is he afraid he's not going to get to participate in?
The war.
Yeah, that the Rohirrim are just going to leave him behind, right? His fears are not unlike Éowyn's, right? She doesn't want to be left behind either, right? There's a point in the Passing of the Grey Company chapter where she is conversing with Aragorn, and he's trying to get her to see her duty in a positive light, right? Or what he sees as her duty in a positive light. He says, your duty is with your people. Too often have I heard of duty, she cried, but am I not of the house of Eorl, a shield maiden and not a dry nurse? I have waited on faltering feet long enough. Since they falter no longer, it seems, may I not now spend my life as I will? Few may do that with honor, he answered. But as for you, lady, did you not accept the charge to govern the people until their lord's return? If you had not been chosen, then some marshal or captain would have been set in the same place, and he could not ride away from his charge were he weary of it or no. So,
I was trying to find it the whole time.
Yeah. But it's like the thing that's like that troubles me about this, right? Is it sounds almost like Aragorn is saying to her, it's like, well, if you go, then some dude can't, right?
Yeah.
Somebody has to stay behind, and it might as well be you because you're a woman. Shall I always be chosen, she said bitterly. Shall I always be left behind when the riders depart to mind the house while they win renown and find food and beds when they return? A time may come soon, said he, when none will return. Then there will be need of valor without renown, for none shall remember the deeds that are done in the last defense of your homes. Yet the deeds will not be less valiant because they are unpraised. And she answered, all your words are but to say, you are a woman and your part is in the house. But when the men have died in battle and honor, you have leave to be burned in the house, for the men will need it no more. But I am of the house of the Earl and not a serving woman. I can ride and wield blade, and I do not fear either pain or death. So, Eowyn is irritated that not only that she is to be left behind, but also that this person that she, loves with a kind of idolization, right, is telling her that her duty is here, right?
Yeah.
Now, for Mary, I think the fear is closer to some stuff that we talked about when we talked about the children of Huron, right? You remember when we talked about what the characters Sador/Labadal and Brandir the Lame had in common? And Gwyndor, the maimed elf?
Oh, they were all disabled.
Yeah, they were all disabled and they were all non-combatants, right?
Yeah.
And people didn't listen to them because they weren't forward men of arms, right? And I think that kind of like Mary's situation in particular, and Pippin's a little bit too, relates to this, right? Mary and Pippin, however brave they might be, right? They're hobbits. They're small. They're not particularly strong. Their people are not skilled in warcraft.
Well, I mean, even the guard that helps Pippin, Baragorn,
Baragond, yeah.
Baragond,
Mm-hmm.
even said, "You're like one of our children, maybe not even
Yeah.
I'm 9 years old."
Yeah.
And Pippin responds, "Well, technically, I still am a child. I
Yeah,
haven't come of
that's
age
true. Yeah,
yet."
yeah. He's right. Hobbits mature slowly, and they don't come of age till they're over 30. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, when he meets, when he meets Baragond's son, right? Baragond's 10-year-old son is bigger than he is, and jokingly says, "I could stand you on your head." But yeah, I think the point is that like Mary in particular fears being shamed, right? He fears, being shamed because he is physically less able to participate in battle than, say, the strong and healthy riders, right? And Pippin seems not to feel the same level of shame, but perhaps this is in part because he is closer to where the action is about to occur, right? He is, whether he likes it or not, he is in a fortress preparing for war. Mary is still off on the frontiers on his way to the war, right? So, I think that there is still some of that that idea of shame at being regarded as malingerers, right? Right, people whose courage wasn't quite up to the task. That I think is, there's a lot of evidence was so prevalent in that generation of young men who went to war in 1914. Right, and then Tolkien himself was accused of being a malingerer because he didn't enlist right away. So Merry and Pippin, I think, are feeling similar pressures here, right? Though Merry is pretty eager to go.
Put me in. Everyone's like, I'm stuck here with a semi-mad king. I'm just gonna.
Well, but one thing, like Denethor is most assuredly not a king.
Or
right?
stewards.
Yeah.
Stewards,
That is
sorry.
one thing that the people of Gondor are pretty insistent on, right?
Yeah, doesn't Gandalf even say he is a steward, but he would carry himself as a king?
Yeah. But remember that system of hierarchy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is reinforced physically in the 7 layers of the city. The steward sits in an unadorned chair in front of the throne. He doesn't sit on the throne. Because to do that, right, would be a usurpation of that hierarchy based on lineage. And I think that's another thing that we need to remember is that hierarchy is based on descent from the Númenórean houses. And the fact that Aragorn comes from the house of Elendil, right, rather than just the house of some steward. There is that real insistence here on the importance of lineage and of blood.
Is that why Gandalf doesn't want Pippin to say anything about Aragorn? Because Denethor would lose the power he's held for so long.
Yeah, he's wary of doing or saying anything that might further stress out or upset Denethor, right? And this northerner coming to supplant him, he would have to give way because that's the way the whole hierarchy works, right?
Yeah.
But another thing that Aragorn then represents, right? Change. Things will be different. And that seems to be one of the things that the Gondorians particularly fear, right? They want this endless life unchanging. And I think, we'll get, in the next section, Denethor will make a statement to this effect, right? That, he wants things to be the way they've always been in his life. And if he can't have that, then he wants nothing.
Yeah.
Now,
A little dramatic, but...
a little.
All these old men are dramatic.
Yeah. Well, and that's
Sorry, but
yeah.
they are.
Uh-huh. Well, and I think like one thing that we're seeing over the course of this is, on the one hand, like a passing of an older world into a new world, right?
Yeah.
But in many ways, this new world is a restoration of an imperfect older world, right? Or a more perfect older world, right? A better order. So we're having a steward replaced by a king, for example, who's going to sit on that throne. He's going to replant the white tree, and everything's going to come back to life, right? We'll have links reestablished between various kingdoms, right? This old generation, even Theoden, the old king who has been regenerated, will himself then die and give way to Éomer, right? To his nephew, right? To a younger, more energetic king. And the younger hobbits will become the new leaders in a rebuilt and reformed Shire, right? Which has been scoured of Saruman's nasty influence, and Frodo, the oldest of them, right? Who's he's a generation older than the others, will kind of fall by the wayside and be ignored, right? So it seems like much of this restoration of the old order is being done or will be done by young people, by an up-and-coming generation rather than the generation currently at the top, right?
Yeah.
But there's one other thing I want to discuss when we're talking about these carven images and these this preservation of an ancient world. In the Muster of Rohan chapter, early in the chapter as they're going to the fortress at Dunharrow, there's the riders are mustering. There's a paragraph that starts with, Mary wondered how many riders there were.
Okay, I found it. Mary wondered how many riders there were. He could not guess their number in the gathering gloom, but it looked to him like a great army, many thousands strong. While he was peering from side to side, the king's party came up under the looming cliff on the eastern side of the valley. And there suddenly the path began to climb, and Mary looked up in amazement. He was on a road the like of which he had never seen before, a great work of men's hands and years beyond the reach of song. Upwards it wound, coiling like a snake, boring its way across the sheer slope of rock. Steep as a stair, it looped backwards and forwards as it climbed. Up it horses could walk and wains could be slowly hauled, but no enemy could come that way, except out of the air, if it was defended from above. At each turn of the road there were great standing stones that had been carved in the likenesses of men, huge and clumsy limbed, squatting cross-legged with their stumpy arms folded on fat bellies. Some in the wearing of the years had lost all features save the dark holes of their eyes that still stared sadly at the passers-by. The riders hardly glanced at them. The pupil men, they called them, and heeded them little. No power or terror was left in them. But Mary gazed at them with wonder and a feeling almost of pity as they loomed up mournfully in the dusk.
Yeah, so this mirrors pretty closely Pippin's procession up that line of carved statues of kings, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the image and the effect here is different, right? So these pupil men, pupil, by the way, is taken from an Anglo-Saxon word that means goblin.
So these goblins.
Yeah. How do they differ from this line of carved kings? How are these sculptures different?
They're short and stumpy and ugly,
Uh-huh.
essentially, and they don't garner any regard or even notice, while the statues of the men, the kings,
Uh-huh.
Pippin's just like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, they inspire awe, right?
Yeah.
But all Mary feels when he looks on these statues is pity, right?
Mm-hmm.
No power or terror was left in them. Right? They'd lost all features save the dark holes of their eyes that stared sadly at the passersby. So, the faces of these statues are worn off, right? Which means there's no individuality here, right?
Yeah. No one's taking care of them.
Yeah. But then, in chapter 5, we meet these men, not creatures, they're not creatures, they're men, who are alternately referred to as the Woses, and the wild men of Druid and Forest. So there's a paragraph starts, presently he came to an open space where Mary first sees one of the Woses.
Presently he came to an open space where a small tent had been set up for the king under a great tree. A large lantern covered above was hanging from a bough and cast a pale circle of light below. There sat Theoden and Eomer, and before them on the ground sat a strange squat shape of a man, gnarled as an old stone, and the hairs of his scanty beard strangled on his lumpy chin like dry moss. He was short-legged and fat-armed, thick and stumpy, and clad only with grass above his waist. Mary felt that he had seen him before somewhere, and suddenly he remembered the pupil men of Dunharrow. Here was one of those old images brought to life, an alien creature descended in true line through endless years from the models used by the forgotten craftsmen long ago.
So what do you think is going on here? Why do you think that this figure, right, Ganburigan, the chieftain of this particular tribe of Woses, is connected here to these pupil men? And by the there's another just to talk a little bit more about sources here, right? So just as pupil in pupilman comes from this Anglo-Saxon word for goblin. You may or may not remember from Sir Gawain in The Green Knight this reference to wood Woses. And yeah, wood Woses in medieval literature and iconography are these kinds of wild woodmen. They're usually depicted as like wielding wooden clubs and wearing animal skins, if anything.
Sounds like druids.
This would be kind of like definitely like a kind of post-druidic kind of thing, right? But yeah, they're supposed to be kind of like uncivilized and like really almost more like satyrs or fauns than like human beings, right? So that's the imaginative origin of Ganburigan. Although there seems to be an element here also that relates him to certain indigenous peoples of Africa, the Americas, and Australia, right?
Yeah.
You said yeah, pretty readily. What sorts of things about him remind you of the way?
Just his, let's see. I mean, the way he's dressed, he's just wearing some grass on his waist. That's
yeah.
Many, especially in South America and in Africa, that's how a lot of tribal people dress.
Mm-hmm.
He's fat leg, he's got big old arms, maybe to suggest that he's had a hard life. He lives by labor. You don't have skinny arms sitting around. He looks wild. Probably doesn't bathe often. And when he does, it's probably for something important. And a lot of tribes, they don't bathe unless for some important ceremony.
Sure. Although we're not really told anything about him looking dirty or any particular smell, right? But go ahead.
Sorry, I misread that. I saw his scanty beard straggled on his lumpy chin like dry moss. So
yeah.
When I read that, all I could see is maybe comparing him to Theoden and other like men is maybe theirs is more groomed versus where his more wild.
Yeah, I think like part of what's going on here too is that it's engaging in a similar kind of hierarchy building that Faramir was doing in his little kind of like potted anthropology, right?
Yeah.
Which I think in some ways tells us more. I think that some of what Faramir says that tells us more about his worldview and the educated Gondorian worldview than the novel's worldview necessarily. But I think that the way the Woses are depicted is still pretty problematic in a lot of ways. For one thing, that other characters refer to them as ugly and as unlovely, right? and that they speak this kind of broken pidgin common tongue, right? That is very reminiscent, in particular, of the way Native Americans speak in cowboy movies, right? You know, like when Ganburigan calls Theoden, father of horsemen, right? That seems kind of like straight out of like a 1940s era movie, Western, the sort of thing that an Indian chief or an Indian scout would say to, the cowboy hero, right?
Yep. Father of horsemen, he said, we fight, hunt only, kill Gorgum in woods, hate orc folk. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
When in reality, there's a flow to their native.
Yeah, and I think that there's a complicated thing going on here, because on the one hand, they are being represented as these kinds of indigenous stereotypes, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we're told specifically that they resemble these old carvings of the Pupil men, right? And what, if nothing else, do we know about the carvings of the Pupil men, right, that are leading up to the Pass of the Dead? That those things are ancient, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. And so these woses are linked, at least visibly, to an older culture that built roads and fortresses and carved statues, right? Which indicates that at one time they may have been much more technologically and culturally sophisticated than they are in the novel's present, right? Which may also, and this doesn't diminish, I think, how problematic they are in other ways, but I think this may also serve as a kind of lesson to the Gondorian obsession with, casting their own image in stone and things like that, right? Stone images fade, right? They erode. You can't build a statue that, a statue lasts a long time.
But
yeah,
the elements are going to take it over.
Yeah, I mean, think of the statue that Sam and Frodo run across the crossroads, right? The headless king, who's his head's been replaced by a rock with a lidless eye painted on it. There's graffiti all over him, and yeah, there is that the flowers have grown to give the old carven head a new crown, right? But the king represented by that statue is not recognizable to Frodo and Sam, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a similar thing going on here, right? This kind of notion, perhaps, of the ebb and flow of civilizations. And there are people who push back against the idea that the Woses are depicted as simple stereotypes. For example, the Ganburigan doesn't simply, he doesn't just simply let Theoden push him around or put himself into a subservient position, right? He talks back when he's questioned. He insists on his own honesty, and even on his own ability to count, right? It's like, we're not, we're wild free, but we're not children, right? Yeah. I can count stars in the sky, I can count leaves in the trees, I can count men in the dark. And then he goes on to prove how well he is able to count according to their standards, right? Basically, I understand quantities, right? I'm not just counting on my fucking fingers here, right?
Yeah.
We're not we're not stupid. Is basically what he's saying here, right?
Yeah, but I think we also see that, in these old westerns when we do have a Native American and the cowboy. At first the cowboy's like, oh, you're stupid, you're a savage.
Yeah.
And the Native American's like, no, I'm really not, dude. I'm actually pretty smart, and you need me to survive.
Yeah.
You need me more than I need you.
Yeah.
I think we get this, this is proved here with the Woses. Because, I mean, they're just content to go about their day. And they're like, y'all need us more than we need you.
Yeah.
You're not going to get to Minas Tirith without us.
Because they remember roads that other people have forgotten, right? So there is sort of this kind of your repository of past memory here as well. But it's also made pretty clear to us that they belong to the past, right? For one thing, in the description of the pupilmen, again, remembering that there's no power or terror left in them. And given that, we're told that the Woses are so few, right? That there simply aren't very many of them. Certainly not enough to help make a difference in the battle, but enough to show Theoden and his companies a new and better road, right?
Yeah.
So the help that they can provide is not battlefield help. They're kind of beyond a point where they can do that. But the last thing that I really do want to discuss today, I want to talk about the paths of the dead as well. What did you make of that journey? What's the whole point of the whole paths of the dead journey?
It's like a let me say that word.
Okay, yes. You remember the word?
It's a catabasis in a
yes.
way. Because they have to, I mean, Aragorn and the company have to go through this. Because they need the dead to help them in the fight.
And I think, like, this raises another question, though. It's like, what's in it for these oath breakers?
They get to rest.
Yeah. So this raises the question then, it's like, does Aragorn have to undergo this in order to get help for himself, or in order to release these chained spirits, right? So who's helping who more?
I think Aragorn's helping the Oathbreakers more because they're finally able to rest in peace. But the Oathbreakers are helping him by giving that added support.
Sure. And at least, here in the book, right, the only support they give him is off screen, right? They help him stop the fleet coming from Umbar that is, going up the river to Minas Tirith. There's been some stuff written about a potential source for the whole Oathbreakers idea. A 12th century Latin text called the Exercitus Mortuorum. Which translates to armies of the dead. And, pardon?
I was about to say, nice little bit of light reading.
Well, I think, one thing we have to remember is that, Tolkien was a specialist in medieval literature, right? So that's where that's where he draws a lot of his inspiration from, in a variety of languages. He was also, proficient in many different languages. And essentially what this text describes are kind of like large groups of dead souls who are unable to pass on to the afterlife simply kind of like wandering the earth in something not unlike the Catholic concept of purgatory. So how familiar are you with the idea of purgatory? Do you know what purgatory is?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I'm very familiar with the idea of purgatory. It's limbo. It's a middle space.
Mm-hmm. Limbo is actually a separate, in Catholic theology, it's a separate realm. Limbo is where the unbaptized virtuous dead go, or at least the unbaptized non-sinful dead.
Purgatory is not heaven, it's not hell.
Yeah.
It's a gray space.
Well,
in a way.
It's less gray than limbo is, right? Because purgatory is a place you have the chance to get out of. At least according to medieval Catholic theology, I think this is less emphasized in contemporary theology. According to medieval Catholic theology, it's basically it's nearly impossible for someone to die without some minor unconfessed sins on their conscience. Now, if you die with unconfessed mortal sins on your conscience, like really, really horrible things that you've done, you go straight to hell.
Okay.
And there's no escaping from hell. There's no getting out. However, the purpose of purgatory is to atone for your sins so that you can then move on to paradise, right? And yeah, supposedly most souls wind up in purgatory rather than going straight to paradise.
And see, purgatory's never sat well with me.
Uh-huh.
Just because of the idea of confession.
Yeah.
But why is there purgatory if we have confession? Or why is there confession if there's purgatory?
Sure. Well, and I think like confession can the ritual of confession, at least if your repentance for your sin is sincere, ideally is supposed to either save you from purgatory or lessen the amount of time you spend there, right? At the very least, it can make the purging you get there less severe, right? But yeah, the whole idea is to sort of kind of burn the sins out of you.
Yeah.
And I think there are a number of critics who argue that the whole thing about the oath breakers is actually a similar kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. That on the one hand, like the oath breakers didn't sin by fighting for Sauron. They sinned by not showing up to fight for Isildur because they were afraid of Sauron, right? So what Aragorn does for them is give them a chance to atone for that mistake and thus be released. Right, they now have a chance to go wherever it is the souls of dead men go, right? This is something that Tolkien is never clear on. We know where elves go when they die or cross the waters, right? But he doesn't really have anything to say about afterlives for anyone else, except special cases like Frodo and Bilbo.
Hey, just help me slow down this army coming. We'll count it as, a Hail Mary and an Our Father, you're good.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're absolved.
Yeah, absolution for everyone.
Go away.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the fact that the Pukel men line the road leading up to this place, right, leading up to Dunharrow, where the Pass of the Dead are, suggests a connection between the Woses and the Oathbreakers. Whether they are, of the same people or not, right? There seems to be some kind of relationship there.
Well, could you say, because it's no man who has passed through the Pass of the Dead has made it out alive.
Uh-huh.
Could you go back to that idea where these places where we have this idea, like if you go through here, you will die, and there's usually covered in spooky statues, or maybe not even, I don't know, like I feel like the statues of people men are warnings, like, hey, don't come here, this is a bad place, this is forbidden, and in a way the woodwoses protect that idea, like no mortal man should come through here, and you will not make it through, do not pass go, do not collect 200.
Yeah, and I think I would be willing to buy that if we weren't told specifically that there's no power or terror left in the statues, right?
Yes.
And if we could see any clear activity of the Woses around Dunharrow, like trying to stop people from going there.
Maybe when the statues of the people men were still fresh.
Right.
Sure, but now the rightful king has come. You know, Isildur's heir.
Yeah, although he's also not the one who sees the statues.
No.
It's Merry the Hobbit who sees the statue, and the riders are just ignoring them. So I'm not trying to shoot down the idea, right? I'm just trying to. But yeah, I'm trying to think if there was anything else that I really wanted to cover today, and I think we're at about an hour, and we have we've covered most of what I wanted to talk about. Is there anything that you wanted to discuss that we didn't get to, or?
I probably read too far where Ewan and Mary take out the black captain.
Okay, well, yeah, we'll get to that next time. Because I think I would imagine that there's probably something about that in Nick's presentation. So
probably.
We'll let him handle that, and and then I'm sure you can discuss that as well in your presentation. Yeah. And I didn't have time to write out the guide questions for this one, so I'll just email them to you this afternoon. But yeah, you are otherwise free to go.